Did you ever stare up at the stars and wonder, what's up there? I'm sure I'm not the only one who had spent hours of my youth learning everything that I could about space. It's hard not to look at the sky on a really clear night and think about what tiny little creatures we are on a small speck of sand in an ocean that we call the universe. Now, as a child with such a free imagination, it's hard not to wonder what kinds of interesting things would be on those other specks of sand. Today, I want to talk about the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster and how it changed space exploration for the future. Now, I want to warn you in advance that this is not a happy story, but it's one that really sat with me and I wanted to share with you all. Now, a little background on the space race. So, in the mid 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were really close to getting satellite technology. They were so close they could almost taste it, you know? So, this sparked the question, who would be the first person to put a man on the moon? So this kicked off the space race. Now, the Soviet Union was the first country to put a satellite up into space and the first country to send a man into space. But the United States got the first man on the moon. The space race had gone on for nearly 20 years before Neil Armstrong was the first man to step on the moon on July 20th, 1969.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And that officially ended the space race. Really brief history on that. Now, after the space race, NASA was like, oh, hey, people like this whole going up into outer space business. Let's keep that going. So NASA had this beautiful futuristic vision of laboratories and research centers in space, right? Think about our modern day International Space Station. In their quest to get these research laboratories in space, NASA created 4 different space shuttles that were tasked to bring up all of those supplies to create that research laboratory in space. Now, these space shuttles were called the Columbia, the Challenger, the Discovery, and the Atlantis. And like I said, these shuttles were going to take up supplies into space, but they could also take astronauts and help further space exploration, right? Now, people were excited about this, and so NASA was like, let's hit the ground running, let's get these space shuttles going. And after the first few launches, it kind of became business as usual. So after the first 5 or something launches, people were kind of like, oh, cool, yeah, great. Now, I think at this point, people were kind of forgetting how dangerous it was to send people to space. That brings us to January 28th of 1986. It was a cold day, much colder than usual when the Challenger was getting ready to launch. This was the 25th time that one of the space shuttles would have been launched. This mission was different because it gained a considerable amount of notoriety in the media because it was the first attempt by NASA to send a teacher into space. Christina McAuliffe was a 37-year-old teacher who was being sent up on this mission to wrestle up some excitement about space among the children. While she was in space, she was going to teach a couple of lessons remotely to her students. But that never happened because 73 seconds after the launch, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, killing all of the crew.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Reporters, onlookers, students all watched in horror as they saw the space shuttle just explode into a bunch of little pieces. And the crew knew something was wrong. Mike Smith was the pilot of this mission, and his last words were, uh-oh. Yeah. So it was initially thought that during the explosion, the cabin depressurized, killing the crew immediately. But we later found that not to be true. The cabin maintained its pressure, and this means that the crew was probably alive for the entire 3-minute descent down to Earth. Now we know that because the crew had enough time to set off their emergency air packs somewhere between the explosion and their drop back down to Earth. So we don't know how long they were alive, but it's horrible nonetheless. The night of the disaster, President Reagan addressed the United States public and had some really wonderful words to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
Right after the disaster, people were grieving. But after the grief went away, they had questions. And people wanted answers. They were like, we need to get to the bottom of this. And so they did. In the wake of the disaster, President Reagan launched a federal commission to get down to the bottom of this and figure out how the Challenger was able to explode like this. This federal commission was later called the Rogers Commission. Now, the people who were members on this commission were decorated astronauts like Sally Ride, Neil Armstrong, and physicists, engineers, military personnel. So I'm saying that these people knew what they were talking about. So remember how I said it was cold? That was a major contributor to why this disaster happened. The biggest contributing factor to this disaster was that the rubber O-rings that sealed parts of the rocket boosters malfunctioned because of the cold. And I'm just so pissed off because before the disaster happened, NASA knew. The engineers knew this was an issue. And the engineers told their higher-ups, hey, we've only launched in temperatures around 53 degrees Fahrenheit. We don't recommend that you launch if it's lower than that. And sure enough, on January 28th, the weather was colder. But they decided to launch anyway. So like I said, the Rogers Commission found that higher-ups at NASA knew about this. But they knew as early as 1977, 9 years before the Challenger launched. So this entire time, they were just putting other astronauts in harm's way until this type of disaster happened. They were gambling with people's lives for 9 years. And things just kind of fell off here. Okay, NASA obviously lost funding and they stopped sending astronauts into space for a little while, but it doesn't change the fact that they were putting people in harm's way for 9 years. It said on the day of the explosion, engineer Bob Ebling and 4 other engineers were trying to tell NASA officials not to launch. One of the officials' responses was, "My God, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" So clearly, they didn't seem to care. Bob was distraught, calling his daughter, insisting he knew this space shuttle was going to blow up. And it did. It's kind of crazy to me that none of those officials ever had any legal repercussions brought against them. They were warned, but you knew people were going to die and you just let it happen? That just doesn't sit right with me. If you knew that someone was going to die because of your work, would you let it happen? Or would you make it known? I feel like it's their professional duty to say something, and otherwise they're negligent. And I don't know anything about law, so I could be just speaking out of my ass, but there were no legal repercussions. And when I was researching this case, a lot of people said, oh, the guilt that these people carry with them must be punishment enough. But I don't think I agree. It's not just the fact that this disaster happened, it's that you allowed 24 other missions to launch when you knew something like this could happen. To be clear, my frustration lies more with the NASA officials, not necessarily the engineers who were trying to warn them. I guess the reason that I really wanted to talk about this today was because if you know something is wrong, speak up, okay? This doesn't have to be quite as big as somebody's life's at stake. But I mean, just in your everyday life, if something is going wrong, if something is not kosher, say something. I'm sorry, I got really worked up there for a second. Got to be kind of a heavy video. I know, I'm sorry. But after this disaster happened, I think it really made NASA rethink what was going on. Okay, because they had to completely re-strategize and they had to stop sending civilians into space because they didn't send another one into space for the next 22 years. Because remember, Christina was not an astronaut, she was a teacher. She was just a regular civilian like us. I guess another good thing that came out of this disaster was that NASA was able to change safety protocols to make sure that things were a lot safer for their astronauts. Like, astronauts are no longer responsible for repairing satellites when they're in space. That was a major safety hazard, and there were just other general safety protocols put into place for astronauts as well. I'm sorry that video got really heavy, you guys, but that's all I have for you on the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, then definitely let me know down in the comments, leave a like, subscribe if you want. All right, that's all I have for you. Bye!